Today, we are proving that too much of a good thing can be bad for you. So we're talking about insulin resistance and what you can do to prevent and even reverse it and bring back insulin sensitivity. Now, on their own, intermittent fasting and a ketogenic diet are good measures to mitigate against insulin resistance. But together, they form a synergistic, unstoppable force that attacks insulin resistance on two fronts. I'm Joe with Wellness Weigh-In, registered nurse by profession, health coach by passion. We're taking out the whiteboard today, so just sit back and let's go. The first thing we need to do is understand the relationship between glucose and insulin. During digestion, carbohydrates that we take in our diet, with the exception of fiber, are broken down into glucose molecules, which then enter into the bloodstream for use throughout the body. Now, our optimal range, or our normal range for our blood glucose level, is 70 to 99. As glucose levels rise, it triggers an insulin response, and it is insulin's responsibility to act as a key, if you will, to open up the cell to allow glucose to flow into the cell for energy production and thus decrease the blood glucose level. Now, this is insulin's primary purpose. So what's the issue with insulin? Well, the issue really lies with our standard American diet, which exhausts this metabolic pathway to the point where our cells resist our own insulin. Look at two major attributes of the standard American diet. Number one, time. We have zero restrictions on time. We eat all day long, whenever we want to eat. I remember when I first took an assessment of my own eating habits, I was having breakfast at 7 a.m. and not finishing my last bite until around 10 p.m. at night. So you're talking about 15 hours of eating and only 9 hours of fasting during my sleeping hours. That's quite a long time of an eating window. The second attribute is carbohydrates. We have zero restrictions on carbs. Think of the base of the food pyramid made up of breads, rice, grains, pastas, cereals, all carbohydrates, and all broken down into what? You got it, glucose. So at the nexus of these two attributes is the standard American, or the average American, you and I, eating all the carbs we want all day long. So let's take a look at this graph right here. This graph represents the standard American diet and its effects on both our glucose and insulin levels. The red line is the glucose level and its fluctuations throughout the day. This can also represent our insulin levels. We know that insulin levels rise in response to elevated glucose levels. In between the green parallel lines, that's the optimal range for both our glucose and our insulin levels. I want you to notice two characteristics right away about this graph. One is the duration, how long the waves are lasting. The second characteristic is the elevation, or the amplitude, how high the waves spike above the optimal range. So these two characteristics are directly related to the two attributes of the standard American diet that we mentioned. Number one, the unrestricted time that we ate. This is my graph here, and I was eating breakfast at 7 a.m., a snack, lunch around maybe 1 p.m., another snack, dinner around 5 or 6, and then finish off with another snack or dessert in the late night. And the time that I ate, those 15 hours, meant that my insulin was spiking for approximately 15 to 17 hours of the day. The other attribute would be the unrestricted carbohydrate intake, and that is directly related to the elevation, or the amplitude, of the waveforms. See how high they're spiking above that optimal range? I was eating donuts, cookies, desserts, having lots of breads, and causing my glucose to spike up real high, which in turn triggered that insulin response. Now, the third attribute, or the third characteristic of this graph, is really a kicker, and I want you to notice this. From the moment that I ate breakfast until late at night when I finished up my dessert, my blood glucose, and therefore my insulin levels, were never allowed to dip back into normal levels, because I was having 3 meals a day and having all those snacks in between and afterward. My blood glucose level never came back into normal range. Now, this happened all day long. So imagine this all day long, every day for weeks, months, years, and even decades. It's no wonder that our standard American diet leads to insulin resistance. And without interventions, this eventually leads to higher and higher insulin levels over time. So now what's wrong with insulin? Isn't it a necessary and good thing for our body? Well, yes, but this is where too much of a good thing can be bad for you. I'm referencing an article linked in the description below. High insulin levels are associated with increased health risks. Number one, an increased risk for obesity. Insulin blocks lipolysis. Lipolysis is the breakdown of fat tissue. As a matter of fact, insulin is a fat storing hormone. So as long as your insulin levels are elevated, your body is thinking, I need to store excess calories as fat. So huge risk for obesity. Number two is high insulin levels are associated with an increased risk for type 2 diabetes. As we get insulin resistant and our bodies reject our own insulin, our cells will no longer open up to that insulin key. And instead of going into the cells, the glucose stays in the bloodstream, thus keeping your blood glucose levels elevated. And there are a number of ways to diagnose type 2 diabetes. Some of the more common ways are, number one, hemoglobin A1C, which is blood work that tells you your average blood sugar throughout the day for the previous 90 days. And anything above 6.5% is considered type 2 diabetes. Also, you can check a fasting blood glucose level. So just before you eat breakfast after your sleeping hours and you're fasting, if you check your blood sugar at that point and it's 125 or higher, that's concerning for type 2 diabetes. Anything from 101 or 100 to about 124 is considered pre-diabetic. High insulin levels are also associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. High glucose levels are very damaging to our veins and our arteries and damaging to our nerves as well. So you run the risk of, heart attack and stroke. Insulin levels are also associated with a decrease in health span. When you think of health span, think of the time frame in an individual's life where they're considered generally healthy. And high insulin levels work to decrease that. And then finally, high insulin levels are associated with a decrease in life expectancy. So bringing down insulin levels is paramount to achieving optimal health. So now that you understand the relationship of glucose and insulin, and you also understand how the standard American diet is geared towards keeping our insulin levels high by having zero restrictions on time and carbohydrates, you can now understand how intermittent fasting and a ketogenic diet work to prevent and even reverse insulin resistance. And they do so by addressing those very two attributes. Intermittent fasting addresses the time aspect, and a ketogenic diet addresses the carbohydrate portion. So let's take a look at the top graph here. This represents an individual who is engaging with intermittent fasting, but not a ketogenic diet. They're still on the standard American diet in regards to the carb intake. So you'll notice that this person has restricted their eating window to just 8 hours, from 11 a.m. to about 7 p.m. This means that they're fasting for 16 hours out of the day. This allows, as you can tell by the graph, the blood glucose and insulin levels to come back to normal range and stay there for a prolonged period of time. Now, this does two things. One, there are a lot of benefits of fasting for prolonged periods of time. I'll link a video at the end that you can watch on that. The second thing it does is that it brings back and maintains insulin sensitivity, which is the opposite of insulin resistance. So intermittent fasting, again, addresses the time aspect of the standard American diet. So to address the carbohydrate portion, we recommend using the ketogenic diet. Now, a ketogenic diet, number one, is not buying foods that say keto friendly on them. Any diet can be ketogenic. It just has to follow a very specific macronutrient ratio. And there is a little bit of wiggle room here, but that macronutrient ratio is getting 70 to 75% of your calories from healthy fats, getting around 20 to 25% from proteins, and getting just around 5% from carbohydrates, which is typically around 30 net grams of carbs per day. Now, what this will do is that this will switch your body from using glucose for energy to now using fat for energy. And that is a beautiful state that we call ketosis. So let's take a look at this bottom graph here. This represents an individual who is on a ketogenic diet, but is not engaging with any type of intermittent fasting protocol. So they've addressed the carbs, but not the time. So the duration of the insulin and glucose spiking is no different than the standard American diet. But you will notice the major difference, and that is the amplitude or the elevation of the insulin and glucose spiking. They are kept within normal limits or just barely breaching the upper limits of normal throughout the day. That's the beauty of the ketogenic diet, because it's so low in carbohydrates and because they're in ketosis, those glucose and insulin levels are kept low, even at the summit of their spikes. Now, what is this individual missing out on? Well, they're missing out on that prolonged fasting period and all of the major benefits of a prolonged fasting time frame. Now, again, intermittent fasting and a ketogenic diet by themselves are good measures to mitigate the risk of insulin resistance. But if you're looking for a way to potentiate and even expedite results, we recommend using them both together for that synergistic two-pronged attack to bring back insulin sensitivity. If you take a look at the top graph here, this represents an individual who is on an intermittent fasting protocol of just one meal a day. That means they're eating their meal within that 1 hour time frame, thus decreasing the duration of their insulin and glucose spiking. And then they're also using the ketogenic diet as well. And you can tell because the amplitude or the elevation is brought way down and their spike is barely breaching the top of that normal limit. And based on what you're eating, your spike might be a little bit higher, or it might even be a little bit lower if you're, decreasing those carbs even further. But this person is enjoying that prolonged fasting period and all of the benefits that come along with that. However, maybe that's a little bit too extreme for you. Maybe it's a goal in the future and you want to do something now. And if you look at the bottom graph here, this is an individual who's doing a 16-8 protocol with a keto diet. Now, 16-8 means exactly that. You're fasting for 16 hours, again, enjoying all of the benefits of that, but then you're only eating during an 8-hour window, typically from 8 to 4 or maybe 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And therefore, you are working to decrease the time aspect of that standard American diet. And if, again, you're using the ketogenic diet along with that, you're decreasing those spikes to be as close or staying within normal limits as possible. Now, I've personally coached several people who have used both IF and keto to completely reverse their type 2 diabetes and come off all of their diabetic meds. So I know it's possible, and I encourage you, look into possibly doing both of them at the same time for that two-pronged attack. Hey, listen, I'm Joe with Wellness Weigh-In, urging you and telling you you need to weigh in and get off of that standard American diet and address both the time and carb aspect. Watch the next video coming up, like and subscribe. I'm out.